Hello everyone, today we talk about Cremona's history for the first time on our channel for our historical region series. You know that for communal Italy we fundamentally cover the history of all the various Italian city-states, and they're cumulating in a satisfactory manner. You know, there is a bit of cyclicity here. I choose different regions of Europe, make a sort of tour periodically of the wall. And Cremona is a Lombard city on the left bank of the Po River that has a relatively typical development from ancient to medieval times that definitely illustrates all the main changes occurring in this region, in the Po Valley, and more specifically in Lombardy. We will see it better now, because actually I haven't made so much about Lombardy itself. Yes, we did talk about Milan, we did talk about let's say the broader sample. We will look at Barbarossa and the Lombard League, etc. But especially about Milanese history, I think I haven't done in these series anything like comprehensive, because the history is like just for Florence or Venice so big. I think I made just some introduction about the very late medieval centuries, just to give an idea. And so we have to somehow attract more attention just by talking about the main centers. But through the history of the smaller ones, you understand actually a lot about the same greater powers. And Cremona definitely has an interesting history, because at some point was definitely one of the richest cities in Lombardy, but undergoes this decline, being close to Milan, that managed just to take it over predictably. So there is this legend regarding the foundation of Cremona that would have allegedly been created by Hercules himself. Right? In reality, the city was established by the Romans as an avant-post in the Northern Republican times and fortified in 218 BC with 6,000 settlers and an advanced castrum on the banks of the Po River. So with quite a strategic significance, because as we will see, especially as far as the districts of the later communes will form, Cremona is a bit like the, you can argue together with Mantua, Parma, etc., at the very center of the Po Valley. As we will see from antiquity, it dominated a vast series of road networks that make it really a very central, right, across different provinces that made her fortune. So the Romans had already spotted, because they were basically all about that the strategic significance of this center. And Cremona has this interesting early, let's say, role at the time of Hannibal's invasion of Italy, because when the Romans learned of the Carthaginian advance from Spain and Gaul towards the peninsula, they garrisoned it with such force to withstand the Punic one. Right. Later on, of course, the Po Valley was recovered by the Romans after, again, the Gauls had retaken control some areas thanks to Hannibal's crossing, etc. But as you know, it was just like a matter of time before the Cisalpines would be subjugated again. So Cremona, as we'll see now, being very central, became the typical Roman city with an amphitheater for recreational activities, a forum, and the baths. And from her river port on the Padus, the Latin name of the Po, the Via Regina, the Queen Road, began. This was essentially connecting Cremona with what was known as Clavenna at the time. It is today's Chiavenna, passing through the same Mediolanum, so Milan, the ancient center of the Insubres, which means in between rivers, by the way, because imagine the Po Valley in this. In fact, if you know the hydrography of the region, it's very there's a very thick river net, even more at the time. Consider that in the Middle Ages, Mediolanum was something like, it had different canals. Well, it still has today, but they were much more strategic from antiquity. And of course, a great part of this area was to be cleared, reclaimed by the Romans. And in the early Middle Ages, great part of these infrastructures decayed, so that, yes, in the High Middle Ages, Lombardy would become, as you know, essentially the most advanced region in Europe, but it was still covered in many areas in the swamps, forests, etc. And this contributed to definition of the various communal districts at some point that mostly overlapped with the Roman ones, but not always, right, and not so geometrically. And actually Lombardy, that you would expect in this sense to be a bit more squared because of the importance it had at the time, actually has importantly irregularly shaped districts, as we will see now, especially with the Cremonese one that goes a bit opposite to the normal following of the essentially of the Po affluents. In any case, Cremona also was reached by this another consular road that connected the river port with the Lake of Garda, right? In fact, Garda Lacus, also known as the Benacus Lacus. This ran along the west, right? So it would continue as a road up to the Archi Castrum, that is today's Arco, in today's Trentino region. Then the Via Brixiana, that, as you can guess from the name, was a consular road connecting Cremona with Brixia, that is Brescia. Right, so we will see gradually all these various centers. Some of you have also asked me about them. We will, time allowing, cover everything. So you understand, this roads, by the way, were connected with others, right, branching off towards the entire Cisalpine Gaul, the Gallia Cisalpina. This would generate great wealth already in ancient times in this city. In Roman times, Cremona was also the terminal of the secondary branch of the road connecting Milan with Placentia in Via Emilia. We made already multiple videos about Emilian communes, by the way. So these were from the other side of the river, right on the right bank of the Po. This road also branched off from the Laus Pompeia, which is essentially the old Lodi. There was also the Via Postumia, crossing Verona, connecting her to Aquileia in the east and Genoa in the south, and in fact crossing the Po River exactly near the ancient settlement of Cremona. So you understand here an impressive overlapping of roads, of routes of communication, together with the river that, of course, had a more modest traffic than in ancient times that would have in the medieval ones, but that still was significant. In late antiquity, however, all this road net system gradually decayed, as we know. Cremona did maintain her river port, which we don't have any reason to think ever stopped at any time. At least it's attested until the late Roman period. In 69 AD, during the Roman civil wars, Cremona was besieged and destroyed by Vespasian's troops, and then rebuilt with the help of the emperor himself. So you always have this obvious continuity. It was an important locality. However, for a long period, the city eventually disappears from the chronicles of history. This is relatively normal, given that, again, the Po Valley would become mostly controlled by other, by Ravenna, by Milan, by some rulers that didn't give Cremona that much of an importance. There were many cities in the Pobala, so there would not be any reason to mention it, except in some documents, for example, or naming the origin of some illustrious persons. This is completely normal, right? Late antique aristocrats, of course, would remain in the city. The urban continuity in Italy, as you know, is uninterrupted from antiquity to the Middle Ages, especially in these cases. As you know, all these various communes in the north especially would just be the product of all these various Roman cities together with their districts, right? There were newer ones, right, but mostly in the fringe areas, right? For that matter, infrastructurally, the city continued to live on. It is true that Cremona is not a huge city like some of the largest cities, say, in Justinian's times in the Byzantine Empire, were effectively Verona, Milan. You had Ravenna, right? Cremona is just like others, just there, right? And of course, it underwent a decline throughout this era. It was not a significant center. We've seen with Parma, for example, that the Byzantines would keep their Italian treasury there at some point. We don't have this, say, info about a particular role of Cremona during that period. We know it was garrisoned by imperial forces at the time of the Longobards invasion. And this is significant because the city being properly in Lombardy, so on the left bank proper, was exposed, was this bulwark on the river that would hold out the Longobard onslaught for more than 30 years, right? The dynamics are relatively obscure. We've seen really lots of videos about the Longobards and how, of course, everything was not really so divided culturally as we think, in spite of course, the political and rivalry and military activities, right? This city would be, however, and finally taken by the Longobard king Agilulf in 603, who essentially dismembered the Cremonese territory that had already been occupied by the Longobards, likely from really quite some time. So a bit of further geography, Cremona stands on this section of the Po River, comprehended between the mouth of the affluents Adda and Oglio, right? And the shape of the Cremonese countryside is somehow oblong from northwest to southeast, right? It's actually pretty developing in the sense longitudinally, which is not much the case. The Pavese district would be like that, but across different rivers, even the same Po from the on the right bank. The Cremonese district, yes, does have just say across the river in Cremona a little area that will be carved later on. It does cross the Adda at a point, but it's fundamentally confined like that, right? In the north you have the Oglio that divides the countryside with the one of Brescia, right? And in between there is really not much. It's actually more of an agricultural area, even more similar to Emilia than the importantly industrialized one of Lombardy in the say around Milan, in places like Lodi, Pavia, etc. Surely it was, as we will see now, a seat of important economic activities in the Middle Ages, but at the same time, the composite nature of Lombardy, for how it would also develop later on with the centrality of Milan, etc., must be understood here, right? We'll see better which other communes bordered Cremona, because these were essentially their enemies. So the city is, of course, annexed to the Longobard kingdom, and it would remain in this area known as Neustria just like in Francia, in the west, right, the most developed area, the truly Lombard one, as far as that sense of kingship, of administration, of palace, of even of language, right? The Cremona is early on part of this sub branch of the Gallo-Italic dialects that we call properly Lombard, right? So it's in the heart of Lombardy, you can argue, because in the Middle Ages, Lombardy had actually a greater extent than and an undefined one, by the way, than the one the contemporary region has, because the centrality of this area was so strong that it's somehow overflowed all around, so that even some parts of Piedmont or Emilia or Veneto were considered to be Lombardy in a broader sense. And we have, interestingly enough, already in Longobards times, the news of some families that would at least claim this legendary, in fact, past later on, the Colleoni di Crotti di Suardi. This is actually compatible with the social mechanisms of the time, also for other cities of the Longobard kingdom. We do know that, of course, the Roman tradition of municipal pride and political identity and even military autonomy to some degree lived on throughout all the Middle Ages. Lombardy does give us some of these, even epigraphic evidence, as far as certain families that were quite proud of their power, naturally sort of oligarchs in the city, right, controlling some guild, some quarter, etc., and that wanted to, and that were particularly attached to the concept of the city proper, that city specifically, right? So that's a bit of that so-called campanalism that would distinguish the Italian communes, even in their conflict against one another. Yet, they were so because they were aware at that point to be part of a broader kingdom, a broader realm, right? The Longobard dimension here and the centrality of Lombardy in the process is definitely something that gives further prestige to these centers that will develop with this kind of internal dynamism and, as you know, substantial wealth, literacy, and general connections with the rest of Europe as well, considering, as we will see now, as you know, that we have seen many times, the centrality of the Italic kingdom in the Holy Roman Empire, right? The city witnessed definitely already a strong episcopal power from late antique Longobard times. It wouldn't become the seat of a duchy, perhaps exactly for this reason, right? This is an important dynamic because, especially in Lombardy, the kings were not particularly fond of having the figure of a duke that they were trying to essentially get rid of through some public officials, right? And it's a process that in fact intensifies from the center of the kingdom to the periphery, right? The Gastals took over as essentially public administrators and as king's men, and bishops, of course, had a great spiritual charisma. They had been taking care of the populations from quite an early times. These were lands, of course, of old Christianization. And even after the Carolingian conquest, there was essentially no strong affirmation of comital power in Cremona, because the bishop essentially maintained and expanded his control over the city and the countryside, right? This happened quite early on, even in Carolingian times, not even the Ottonian ones that we know to be the ones that made greater use of the figure of the so-called bishop count, which was technically not a count, but was, as a bishop, provided with the comital authority over the district, which is something that essentially the communes born within the same city will hijack, right? Sometimes even on behalf of the bishop formally, but just to extend eventually their control on the countryside themselves. On May the 25th, 825, the Carolingian Emperor Lothar I promulgated the Capitulary of Corteolona, which established the imperial schools, right? And so, in addition to Pavia, that was the capital of the Kingdom of Italy, that, as you know, had been renamed like this to eliminate a bit of that Longobard patina during Carolingian times, Cremona also had a school of law, rhetoric, and liberal arts, witnessing essentially the intellectual prosperity, and not only of the center, inheriting, if you want, a bit that law school legacy founded back in the day by the Roman Emperor Theodosius, but that had, by this point, been successfully surpassed by the Longobard one. I made some videos in the past explaining how much do we think that the Justinian Code, which is essentially, as you know, an improvement of the Theodosian one, of the Perpetua Sanctia of the 4th century, was circulating in Italy after the Pragmatica Sanctia. That is to say, a very few, right? And the Longobards, with the Edictum Rotary, gave birth to a florid juridical tradition that would be paradoxically the same one that would recover from these very centers the Roman one later on, because it was one of the single most legally advanced, easily actually the single most legally advanced country in Europe. They had this Longobard law, then the Frankish capitularies, so also the imperial law, the feudal law, the various customs had been developing the need to recover the Roman one. And we know, speaking of the Cremonese prestige in this cultural centrality, that the students of Piacenza, Parma, Reggio, and Modena, so basically all of Emilia, depended on the Cremonese headquarters. Now, this is fascinating for one simple reason. And again, geographically, like Cremona, as we've seen, is just in the southeast of Lombardy. Technically, you can count Mantua as being shifted, say, further right, and that's really the last step. But Cremona is a bit isolated in this, just in front of the most important centers of Emilia from the other side of the river. And the Carolingians thought that this center could be essentially a secondary one compared to Pavia, the capital of the entire kingdom, that it is also not that far away from Cremona, just some tens of kilometers west, in order to hold further like the political, administrative, and also educational prestige of the same realm, right? So we're talking about great centers of learning for Western European standards. So between the 10th and the 11th century, the Cremonese power kept increasing, right, as a consequence. Thanks mostly to the important concessions to the city's rector bishops. Among them, we remember Liutprand, right, the famous historian of the Antipodesis, essentially the imperial ambassador to Constantinople, who was called to the imperial court in Saxony, while remaining a bishop, and Alderic, who managed to obtain important privileges for the city from the Emperor Otto III. There were others, right? So at this time, understand also the cruciality of the passages. Cremona controlled the bridges towards the south. There were important dynasties that were affirming across Emilia and Tuscany. So these bridges on the Po River were of increasing strategic need now by the revived empire of the Ottonians, that thus tried to secure further loyalty by essentially reconfirming the power that the bishops already had de facto as secular rulers of these cities, right? And increasing in the process the life of the city, because as you know, the Italian communes were born out of a knightly urbanization, essentially a military nature of the communities that inhabited, of the citizenry, but also, of course, of the political, administrative, and juridical crafts of the episcopal retinues, right? Because all these great historians, jurists, etc., revolved around the bishop's cathedral chapter, and they would evolve in what would have become the communal state in practice, the communal bureaucracy. It was the bishops Lambert and Ubald who created, however, disagreement with the Cremonese population over the management of the properties of the monastery of St. Lawrence. Why was this important? Well, because, as we just said, the Cremonese citizenry, that, remember, were Romano-Germanic freemen in arms, something that in Lombardy is felt the strongest from such an early age than any other era in Europe, given that here there was a state that managed to preserve the rights of these citizens, as opposed to more tribal areas that had witnessed essentially the rise of an aristocracy and the sinking of the freemen, right, to the point that they became some sort of, peasants, serfs de facto. These cities were quite aware of their power, again, of their prestige. We do have, even in Longobard times, the local militias constituting a meaningful part of the Longobard army as a whole. So really something that makes you see a much greater continuity than what is mostly thought to have occurred from, say, ancient to medieval times. And the, of course, increasing power of the bishops' counts within the city gates and the district, something that at a point alarms them, because if it had depended on the emperors as kings of Italy, of course, the purpose of providing the bishops with such great power was just to co-opt a very powerful elite that would be loyal to the emperor, and that in this case ecclesiastically could not just did not have all the problems of inheritance, of dynastic entrenchment that instead were quite a problem for the maintenance of a public authority. And of course the citizenry is not entirely happy with this. And of course the 11th century, we talked about it very often, like especially talking about the Pateria, etc., the spread of some new instances of church reform, the fact that, again, there was an apparent contrast between the great political power that bishops had in lay affairs, right? And in fact, the same imperial appointment of the popes rather than the local communities, as an incipient, right, rise of the commune that would in fact appear in the last decades of the 11th century. I made a video about Conrad II that gives you a bit of an idea of what the empire was in the times in which he, in 1037, having settled in the city. This is also essentially the time which he issued the Edictum de Beneficis, right? That this italic capitulary on the inheritance of the larger fiefs that would count, just like the previous capitulary of Quercy-sur-Loise by Charles the Bald, as essentially the cornerstone of feudal law and rights of inheritance, gave even refuge at that point to Pope Benedict IX, the Pope. Here there were lots of issues going on. We can't quite digress. But Cremona was that sort of Ghibelline at heart, right? The later, let's say, appearance of those parts historically is connected also to the different role that these cities had much time before, and in relation to the power and the favors that they had acquired from the emperors. We're seeing it in many other circumstances. And we will see now how, of course, that played as far as the renewal of the Germanic presence in Italy, the Lombard League, and so on. For example, under Emperor Henry IV, and so the hottest moment of the investiture controversy, Cremona refused to pay the oppressive taxes that the empire required and that the local bishop imposed on the citizens in virtue of his comital prerogatives. Thus, there is the birth of a legend that would concern the clash between Henry IV as a prince and John Baldesius, that in Lombard vernacular sounds like Zanen della Bala, right? That was at the time the city's major standard bearer. Were these offices connected with the militia, and these were knights fundamentally, because at the time, again, mostly the communes were born by a consular affirmation. So essentially these were milites that decided to join into the commune and to start ruling it. And they were already significantly in power of this various stuff, also because they were part of the same families of the bishop and or other competitors. And remember, the bishop was elected, so they would fiercely compete with one another for that seat. And the tradition is that Zanen managed to unseat the prince, saving the city from paying the golden bowl. That would be the bala in Lombard. This was essentially a globe of about 3 kilos of gold that the city owed to the emperor every year, and of course symbolizing the imperial power, right? And therefore the same one of the citizenry that at least proportionally had to provide in order to make it. And this initial contrast already with such imposing authority is here highlighted by the fact this bowl was donated to Berta, that was Zanen's fiancée, as a dowry for her wedding, right? That was to say, let's just essentially rule as true, oligarchs here, after having been able to dislodge from here the same emperor of the world, right? And this golden globe, of course, embodying that, right? This is how this Lombard knightly class was seeing the whole thing, and this is brutally fascinating because don't say the story is a legend, but don't think that they would reason in a very different way from this, considering also that there were wars at the time furiously raging all across the region between the supporters of the emperor and fundamentally the papacy already, the Gregorian form of the papal monarchy that had already affirmed itself, especially blowing on the embers of this Lombard resentment against the emperor that was more positively present, in fact, in Lombardy than in other places. A region that was instead growing dramatically in power and in wealth, and that, in fact, in the first phase of the investiture struggle, managed to win that autonomy that fundamentally wouldn't be challenged until the time of Frederick Barbarossa. You know that essentially the Concordat of Worms brings to the papal victory as far as the Italian affairs were concerned. It is literally the episcopal investitures, also the one of these very cities that were essentially negotiating with the papacy, and a political autonomization, that is the one of the commune, against these bishops that had been traditionally appointed by the Germanic emperors, right? So it makes a lot of sense, as you understand. And that's how the communes began to prosper, right? This was a very heavy blow to the Eastern Frankish market. We've seen it in many videos. There is an interesting one I made on the feudalization of episcopal investitures in the same Germany as a consequence, right, of the blow of in the public authority, right, of the German emperors north of the Alps, right, that made that even German episcopate power that's more autonomous from the monarchy. There are historical news a few years later, by the way, regarding the legend that we just illustrated, and the city coat of arms of Cremona commemorates this episode, right, in this legendary past, with Baldasius' arm holding, and I inserted it here in the picture, the golden tribute bowl with the motto bearing the phrase in Latin, late Latin, fortitudo mea in brachio, that is to say, my strength lies in my arm. And that is to say, if I want to hold the world in my hand, I will, even against the Holy Roman Emperor, right, as a knight of Lombardy, but as the communes would have more comprehensively risen at this point. You understand that this is the sap of that Lombard liberty spirit. In 1093, an anti-imperial military alliance was formed, led by Matilda of Canossa, who had numerous possessions astride the Po, including Lodi, Milan, Cremona, and Piacenza. This is particularly important because we're still essentially in the phase of the investiture controversy, and the Canossas, as you know, were essentially the most powerful family in Italy, had this control over basically the entire market of Tuscany, plus this territories in the north across the Apennine to the Po Valley, and even up to the Alpine foothills from the other side. So it is a massive power that extends a sort of with its feudal prestige, like this ties with the most important cities in Lombardy, evidently in in an ambiguous, to say the least, relation with imperial authority that is being battled by again the papacy, and in fact it can count on the Canossa as well. As we know, the excommunication of Henry IV was resolved with the oath of obedience of the emperor to Pope Urban II, and that entailed, as far as Cremona's history is concerned, the donation in 1098 of the Insula Fulcheria, that corresponds essentially to today's area of Crema, that is in the northwest of Cremona, right, near to Lodi, to the same city of Cremona, right, which with this act constituted itself as a free commune, becoming in fact one of the richest, most powerful and populous cities in northern Italy, right. This is particularly important because Crema is not that relevant of a commune on its own, but it would later carve out its autonomy from the same Cremonese. It's actually closer to Milan than to Cremona, so it would easily escape. It's also closer to Bergamo, etc. But of course, this initial influence of the city up to that point, right at some tens of kilometers of distance, where another center was growing, like a bit all these Lombard cities, is fascinating, because normally you have in the history of the Italian communes some sort of initial phase where every commune was more or less on its own, while Cremona here is, open as let's say, enacting some sort of seigneury over other communes. It's not quite would have become the later seigneury, but this early connection, right, this leagues essentially that the Lombards would be initially famous for, were rooted as a general feature distinguishing Lombardy in its cultural homogeneity, right? Degree of urbanization, administrative culture, political cohesion. Consider that Lombardy was the place where the Holy Roman Emperor had to necessarily seize the Iron Crown in order to be able to go to Rome and to be crowned emperor proper, right? So you have to cross the entire Po Valley, so the Alps, these various cities, the various rivers, etc., before even getting to, and you have to cross the Apennine to get into Tuscany, and then you have to arrive to Rome. And if these powerful centers in the north are opposed to you, and this is how all these wars had been fought, like it's obvious that things become much more complicated for the empire as a whole, right? So 1093 constitutes the birth of the Cremonese commune, again born traditionally through this knightly associations, and from there on you have, in fact, the standard life of an Italian commune. Essentially, the city expanding from the within, administratively, militarily managing to consolidate its presence in the countryside, essentially in the wake of the same episcopal power for how it had been created. This is, as we explained countless times, the exception in Europe, right? You don't have in the rest of Europe a commune that manages to create a territorial power, right, in itself. These guys do. They have this, again, districts of Roman origin. They're all kind of close to one another. There are essentially 30 cities in the Italic kingdom fighting against each other for supremacy. They don't quite have individually the capacity to curb one another, at least not yet. And most of their activity against the neighbors is raiding crops, destroying castles. And there is a lot of political intersection, superimposition, infiltration. All these the commune is not an absolute state. It's essentially a pact, right, of knights that rule from the city together with the rest of the people and have this great opportunity of, in fact, concentrating power in that unitary direction, but still having very private business going on. So Cremona borders in the west by Lodi and Crema that separate her from Milan, right? It's this early, buffer that allows the Cremonese to remain autonomous from Milan until, as we will see now, the beginning of the 14th century. Actually, in the very north west, you have a tiny part of the Cremonese district bordering with Bergamo, which, and this, again, they all fought against one another. They're very short distances, after all, just some, at best, tens of kilometers. Then in the north, across the Oglio River, we've said there was Brescia. In the east, you have Mantua. Then across the Po, you have, south of Mantua, the district of Reggio, right, in Emilia. And then, so south of Cremona, from the other south, the other side of the river, you have Parma, the powerful Pallavicini holding that, as we will see now, will grow as also the source of the first super communal signories in the center of the Po Valley. Then you have Piacenza, that actually would grow as a more important city than Cremona, but that, as we've seen, had been quite connected to it also culturally. And essentially, just at a short distance across the Lodi district, you have Pavia, right? That and Lodi, Pavia also will hold out against the Milanese until the early 14th century, but it was Lodi that, complaining of Milanese expansionism, brought Frederick Barbarossa, among the other things, the other reasons, to descend to Italy to curb the Milanese bullying there, because Milan was by far already essentially the largest city in Europe, and it was growing that fast. And imagine it from, I don't know, the perspective here of Cremonese, all these various communes that, again, were not saints, evidently were constantly expanding and defending their own territory, but they hadn't gone as far as Milan, that had literally the demographic and economical resources to take over militarily a bit everybody around, right, or starting successfully to do so. These wars were really numerous, right? Cremona was often victorious at this point. It was, again, this sort of warlike character spirit that brought her to victory in 1107 for the possession of Tortona, while instead in 1111 the Cremonese were defeated near Bressanor. In this period, Cremona had strong internal divisions, like most of the Italian communes, between that part that we can't say the Ghibelline one, right, in favor of, even though the term had not yet come around as such, as you know, is an Italianism stemming from the Italianization of Weiblingen. That was the stronghold of the Hohenstaufen, so here even before the Swabians came to power in Germany. So it was definitely the pro-imperial party that, as we've seen, had this older root in the struggles between the papacy, in fact, and its lay counterpart. The old city tended to stick to imperial loyalty. Consider that when Frederick Barbarossa made a list of all the centers, the vassals that owe him something, and that basically highlight the most important ones, or at least the ones he would practically rely on, because there are very few in, I don't know, in northeastern Germany, etc. Lombardy, the Lombard cities figure prominently, even before his expedition to Italy. And this is a dramatically overlooked aspect in the history of the Holy Roman Empire. That is to say, Lombard vassals went routinely to Germany in these earlier periods to participate to the imperial diets, showing that, of course, they were actually deeply intertwined in the affairs of their northern neighbors, just actively so. And this evidently meant that in these various communes there were those who had specific connections with the emperors. They hoped essentially that the Germanic authority reviving in the area, they could have been co-opted, becoming more powerful as lords, basically as in the rest of Europe, where essentially was the feudal aristocracy that ruled, except, and especially in Lombardy, right, the case was not so in Italy, where the communes were really taking over the various imperial vassals, the various noblemen, knights, etc., that in part, as we've seen, would simply side with the commune and make the commune themselves, and that would become vassals of the commune, which is something that was almost cognitively incomprehensible by, for example, the Frederick Barbarossa, but the Germans in general, because nobody had ever seen anything like this. This level of development, this level of concentrated power, civil organization, and also military force. So held literally by commoners, by people that were able to dictate rule there. Whereas north of the Alps, nobody basically could escape the control either of the lay or the ecclesiastical princes. So another part of Cremona, consequently, the new city, if you want, because the cities were expanding, by the way, also far beyond the old Roman ring, were pro-papacy, right? And the conflict reached the point of creating two communal buildings with the construction, in fact, of the Città Nova Palace, which still exists, and that is a bit like saying, quite well how at this point, more open, less centralized, and somehow, in fact, more in between, literally in the very center of the Po Valley, Cremona was becoming. This is an important characteristic because, again, other communes were, in spite of their internal divisions, actually expanding, consolidating in a more unitary direction. There could be, of course, a faction overthrowing the other and vice versa. This is really typical of the Italian Middle Ages, but the rule would remain from the city, and whoever controlled the city controlled the entire system there. In Cremona, you see that, in fact, the broader statal development that would have happened mostly in the 13th century is somehow more unstable. Perhaps exactly because the early leaders of the commune were tendentially looking more towards the empire, perhaps because they were closer to Milan. They feared this sort of threat, of course, that could expand into their territories would happen later. Because we've seen, for example, a city like Verona that had many strategic reasons to boast its own autonomy, being on the Adige Valley, and so basically the gateway to Italy from the Brenner Pass. There was the preferential route chosen by the German emperors for their Raumfahrt, that had been staunchly pro-imperial, and in this sense also spoiled a bit by the Germanic rulers back in the day. But at a certain point, when they see that the imperial authority is reviving to the point of basically with the Lombard League, etc., asking too much, right, of what the communes had developed fundamentally autonomously as their own prerogatives, they simply side unitarily against in fact, the emperor. And when, in fact, Barbarossa descends to Italy, Cremona allies herself with the emperor, right, who also helped the Cremonese taming the revolt of Crema, that, as we've seen, had been given as a sort of another commune. Again, it's a bit of an exception. It's partly also why they were perhaps reasoning in a more, say, in less centralized way, because they considered this as a sort of potential for expanding in a more territorial way themselves. And this tells you a lot, because then we know how the story went, right? But over the centuries. But consider that those guys were coming from the before, right? And the fact that, remember, the Bowl, right? These guys were already fiercely autonomous from the emperors, but they sort of thought of themselves as emperors because they literally held the imperium as a community of freemen in arms that in the Romano-Germanic tradition was not about being a freeman like another, but being literally noblemen, because you cannot have arms if you're not noble in the deepest traditional religion. And in this circumstance, Milan had showed her aggressiveness towards Cremona. In fact, they had been fueling the same revolt in Crema against the Cremonese to hopefully expand in that area as well. Remember that Lodi and Cremona are just neighbors. They're very, very close, just several kilometers, not more. And Milan was trying to annexate Lodi. And that's the reason why Frederick also, well, the Pope had just been kicked out of Rome by the local commune that was also, hosting some heretical heads, right? And that was the official reason, also because you needed a Pope in Rome to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor. But again, the Lombard crown was necessary for that, and the greater problem was what, in fact, the most powerful city in Europe was doing there, that had to be tamed. So the Cremonese sided with Barbarossa, and they managed to reconquer Crema in 1160, and supporting Barbarossa continuously, also attacked Milan, that, as you know, was destroyed by the emperor in 1162. The Milanese basically rebuilt it from scratch, which tells you just literally what, not just the level of brutality that was showed by Frederick, but the sheer scale of moral and material resources that Lombardy had to literally rebuild the city from scratch. And or almost, of course, not everything was destroyed, but it was just a very heavy blow. I made videos about the ideology revolving around imperial majesty at this point, what was being essentially asserted by the Swabians, and the sense also of revanchism over the same Lombards that a few generations before had literally made the German monarchy almost collapse, and losing a consistent part of its prerogatives within the same Germany. So it was an incredibly fierce struggle, as you know. But it was participated by the same Italians. In this case, Cremona was entrusted with the control of that area of Milan that is the Roman Gate, right? Because they were divided in sections corresponding to these various entrances from the city. That is, in fact, from the side of Cremona in this case. And this aspect is particularly fascinating, of course, because the Cremonese would fight in imperial armies throughout this time. And the victory and loyalty to Frederick allowed Cremona to mint money, and therefore to create her own mint authorized by an imperial bull. This was also an enormous privilege, like just some highly considered powers in the empire could have this most public royal authority of minting coins. It's something that, as we've seen, the Germans do in important centers like even Pisa, and places that had strongly supported the imperial cause throughout this time. And again, you can't find all this in the Italian communes playlist, because every city had a different bias here, right? However, as it is famous, the harshness of Barbarossa ended up inimicating even the same Lombard allies that he had initially from his side. I mean, the same Lodi preferred to side with Milan, that was about literally to conquer her before Frederick arrived, than with the emperor at this point, right? And it is, in fact, in 1167 that Cremona sides with the other Italian communes against the emperor, becoming part of the Lombard League, which would defeat, in fact, with the contribution of Cremonese forces, the imperial troops in Legnano on May the 29th, 1176, causing basically the shattering of the entire European and Mediterranean balance, because from the Holy Land to, in fact, northern Italy, Germany, the Byzantine Empire, everything changed, right? This was a very heavy blow from which actually the Hohenstaufen did recover, fairly quickly as in their international condition, but not much because of what was their first objective that would have, in fact, definitely rendered them the reestablishment of the Holy Roman Empire in its entirety, right, East and West united. That was the conquest of Lombardy, that, however, had been enormously dispendious. So Cremona enjoyed, like the other cities of the Lombard League, finally the rights of autonomy, of all the things that basically Frederick had been asking from these centers, in addition to the ones that were customarily accepted by them as the imperial support. Right? None of these cities ever thought, because it was simply impossible in the mentality of the time, and it would have been extremely dumb, and just in today's times we can't think of a word like this. In fact, that there should have not been an emperor, or that they should have not been part of the same power, as they were proud imperial subjects, and part of this was substantiated exactly in their internationally recognized military success, right? To have essentially defended in arms their rights, right? Their prerogatives, showing their place in the empire, right? So that the emperor was recognized. Lots of things like the Fodrum, whenever the emperors had to descend to Rome, of course the communes had to provide the necessary with the necessary means for the expedition. They were all a set of regular tributes to be paid, etc. But what happens after this is fundamentally that the Italian communes, and especially the Lombard ones, boom dramatically. Right, all what they owed to the emperor was a minor part compared to the unprecedented amount of wealth that the world had ever seen concentrated in single communities. Of course, throughout all this, what the Italians do is that they stop fighting against the emperor, so they resume fighting against one another, as a good rule, right? Trying to, again, bully one another into subjection. The same cities of the Lombard League that was just activated ad hoc whenever it was needed, but and sometimes it was still used as a sort of, league of smaller, say of a smaller group of cities than the previous one against one of the same former members, like it could happen, began to clash again. In 1213, the Cremonese were able to defeat, in fact, a Milanese league made up of the communes of Lodi, Piacenza, Crema, Novara, Como, being supported by Brescia, by the way, that side, in fact, with Cremona, in Castelleone. This is an interesting set of alliance, because you have basically the entire western Lombardy that is clashing against Cremona, and is defended by Brescia, that is timidly, in fact, there in the northeast, and trying to prevent, in fact, this major force coming, in fact, from the west, as Milan and her allies, to try to, again, descend the Lombardy in the southeast along the Po River, and, in fact, undermining the autonomy of these centers. Other communes are watching at the window, by the way, but these are just few instances. The history is incredibly complicated and varied, and so until we come to a series dealing specifically in depth in all these wars, it's very complicated just to make a brief summary of it. In 1232, the link began, however, still in a Ghibelline sense, between Cremona and the Emperor Frederick II, who was involved in a power dispute within the city as well. Now, this is particularly important because, that Frederick was the grandson of Barbarossa, and Cremona had initially supported him, eventually siding, say, in a general and understandable sense with the others, but that Ghibelline spirit was not ending. Of course, it was very opportunistic in a sense, also because they were literally risking, again, to be taken over by Milan. In 1225, Frederick, who has understood the condition of Verona, convenes a diet in the city, leading to the birth of the second Lombard League against him from the other cities. And the new alliance with the empire led to the Battle of Cortenuova against, in fact, the League, which resulted in a Ghibelline victory. Cortenuova is a fascinating battle. We would see it in one of our, in fact, tactical analysis at some point, because it's one of the let's say, less known but still very important proofs of Lombard infantry resistance against the charges of the imperial heavy cavalry that was in the mid 13th century definitely at its historical peak, both morally and technically. The battle ended fundamentally with the Lombards abandoning the Carroccio just at night, having resisted practically until then to these formidable charges that had not managed to break them up to that point, right? And the Cremonese are from the side of Frederick, right? Here also we made different videos about Frederick II. We know what his empire was about. We know how much he resumed that. Also, that very ferocious mask that his grandfather had used against the Lombards, so much so that the same Ghibellines told him to be a bit, say, more pragmatic, also because this was not really the way to make the Lombards fight less, really. So he began to co-opt rather. But the Cremonese role definitely exemplifies the case of a Ghibelline city that sides again with the emperor, so much so that Frederick, that, as you know, lived in Sicily, right, had ruled from the most important possession, right, among the many he had, when in Lombardy, often brought his court to Cremona, right? The only unpleasant episode was, however, the final defeat at the hands of the people of Parma that we've seen in the video about that city in Vittoria, essentially, which is the name of victory in Italian, so called because it was an encampment that Frederick had erected to besiege Parma, that, as I told you before, is just in the face of the Cremonese district across the Po River. And it's very strategic as far as the Apennine crossings especially were concerned. So Frederick besieges this, but the Parmesans carry out a sortie while the emperor is hunting, and the enemies are caught by surprise and crushed. And on this occasion, in fact, the Guelphs captured more than 2,000 Cremonese soldiers that were in the imperial army. All right, so Cremona definitely made that stand for the Hohenstaufen and was dragged down together with them at that point. This is interesting because Parma and Cremona are now ever more in conflict with one another. As we've seen, the city had troubles just to defend herself from the west. Now also from the south there is an increased pressure. And definitely these other cities, especially in Emilia, are rising very fast. And that's scary, right? Whereas Lombardy is establishing, as we will see now, more sort of seigneurial rules that tend to create an hegemonic situation for which what was not succeeding with the leagues was succeeding with lords, right, in unifying mostly from a Milanese direction the entire region. And Cremona, of course, is under pressure, right? Throughout all these wars, they knew what they were betting on, because the alternative was essentially to be taken out in the process. There was nothing to kid about. And evidently here Cremona began to decline, right? Because the international situation deteriorates rapidly for the Ghibelline party. First of all, the Parmesans retaliate against Cremona further. They were, however, defeated by Oberto II Pellavicino. Their carroccio was taken away, and the trousers of some of the Parmesans remained hung for a long time in the Cathedral of Cremona in derision. Right? This again, there is an incredible homogeneity among the Italian armies, right? The Italian politics, society. Here, they are just, again, the same people with different colors based on their communal identity. One of the various houses, of course, that fought as freemen, technically, in that system. But in fact, the rivalry surrounding these cities' competition are incredibly fierce. And so this deep hatred and derision and sense of, again, we are knights fighting for the empire, and we can just kill you and strip you of your clothes and mocking your pants, right, that we hang in our cathedral as a proof to God, as our spoliopin fundamental. It's a tragic thing, but it shows well the increasingly ideological hatred that, especially from the time of Frederick II, even more under Manfred, his natural son and successor as King of Sicily, trying to hegemonize Italy once again under a Ghibelline rule, are really exemplified, right? In 1249, the Pellavicino, that are, again, this Emilian lineage, establish from Cremona a lordship over different cities within Lombardy and Piedmont. This is interesting because already Frederick II had began to establish this overlords of different communes that initially didn't really mean much because they didn't really control literally all these communes. They had, again, their bases in one, with the commune fundamentally supporting them as their lords and being able to kick him out, right, in case of need. But the idea was that if you, again, received, in fact, more resources from all these different centers, a little bit, you could try to concentrate this wealth in a single one, right? However, this Ghibelline lordship, because they begin as the da Romano, the Monferrato, the Pellavicino, as Ghibelline lordships. This is particularly important, considering that Ezzelino, we have seen it for Verona, that where it was located. It was initially a Guelph, and then given the position of Verona, and again the Brenner Pass, etc., Frederick pushes him to become a Ghibelline and to be a lord even of these multiple places, other than just Verona. So that's how the game was starting to happen, because Lombardy had never been really and would never be a region of people, right? The popolo of that would rule in some, for example, communes of Emilia and in Tuscany, because there were some sort of more popular centers with less industries and stratification. Never happens in Lombardy. In Lombardy, you always have essentially the aristocracy, right? The great lords of Lombardy, next to the bishops that maintain a great power, but the people as well. But the latter never essentially succeeding in overthrowing these great lords. And this obviously points to the direction, first of all, a greater surplus, a greater wealth, a greater political consolidation, and this ancient connection of the various cities of Lombardy that paved the road to this greater Milanese lordship, right? That gradually substitutes the forces of the Lombard League, right? Until the 14th century, basically have, again, all these various Lombard cities participating. Say the bigger contingent is the one of Milan, but every one of the allies brings his own force. Then after that, in the early 14th century, you see that the Milanese army becomes much bigger, and the forces from these other communes disappear. And what happens in parallel is exactly that these communes are conquered by Milan. They pay money for just even escaping the costs of war, because legitimately the people do not want to keep on fighting if there is somebody else, especially, I don't know, a German mercenary that can do it for them. But you have, in fact, the death of their political liberties. Right? This is what Cremona now will experience in a painful way, because Cremona was famous, by the way, to be an incredibly wealthy city, right? By 12th, 13th century standards, it was considered one of the most prosperous places in Europe. The beginning of the end was the one of the defeat of Manfred of Sicily in Benevent in 1266. You know what happened there. Essentially, the Pope and Charles of Anjou create this expedition, which is actually a crusade against Manfred of Sicily, and the kingdom is taken over by the French, right, by the Angevins. And as a consequence, all the net of Ghibelline powers that Manfred had supported in central and northern Italy with his 800 German knights in Tuscany collapses. Just made a video about Siena recently, and we just observed the Battle of Montaperti, and eventually the repercussions in Florence, in Siena, of Benevent, of Tagliacozzo, etc. In the same 1266, so when Manfred is defeated, on November the 1st, specifically, Umberto II Pellavicino is expelled from Cremona, because essentially the Guelphs take over control of the city. The Ghibelline government fell. And in the place of Hubert, whatever you want to call him, another Ghibelline actually took power initially. This was Buoso da Dovare. It's extremely complex to explain now what it means to be a Guelph and a Ghibelline in practice, because everybody knows the story. One is for the papacy and one for the empire. But there are circumstances in which there are way other different factors than these ones to determine what is happening there. This guy takes power and hands it over to the so-called Consortium of Peace and Fate, which managed it until 1270. Right. The following year, what happens is that the role of the captain of the people was established, and essentially the communal powers are taken over formally by the Guelphs, right? Popular force was increasing, so you tendentially have this idea that the people are more Guelph and the older knights were Ghibelline. Tendentially, it's not always the case, right? But this is the time in which there are lots of laws against the so-called magnates that were thought to be destabilizing the commune. It's the peak of, because after the wars also against the Hohenstaufen, the situation stabilizes, and the Guelphs extend like a sort of hegemony as on the region, as they're backed by Charles of Anjou that sends them help, etc. And the popular classes expand dramatically as well. Again, this is yet another phase of dramatic boom of Italy. This is the very peak of, again, medieval civilization, as far as, like, here it's the entire French, Guelph, Papal, Neapolitan axis is the one that is factually dominating Europe, right? So, low bureaucracy, the army, it's something that explodes, literally. And in 1276, Cremona passes to the lordship of the Marquis Cavalcabot, which literally means ox rider, which is also, in fact, the on the coat of arms that I inserted here on the picture. This is, again, the typical magnate, actually, that, however, made it not to be exiled because, of course, there were other magnates who were supporting him in the process, and directed the fate of Cremona until 1305. This is a moment of desperate as equilibristic struggle of Cremona against Milan that is increasing dramatically her power. Doesn't matter who is in charge, whether the Delatore or the Visconti. The Milanese are really pressuring Cremona very hard. And the countryside gets ravaged. There are always these exiles from the opposite factions that complain. It's a total mess, right? You can't quite easily handle anymore like back in the day. In any case, Guglielmo Cavalcabò inherits his father's powers until 1310, right? And in this period, actually, Cremona does witness that material prosperity before the fall. For example, numerous building works are carried out at this point. The famous Torrazzo of Cremona's belfry, right, and its octagonal garland with spire, the Romanesque church of St. Francis, the transepts of the cathedral, the lodging of the soldiers. These are all beautiful. Like here, I feel, of course, the video pictures with these buildings. But this reflects a broader prosperity, especially what the Cremonese countryside was thought to be, right? Numerous agricultural arrangements date back to the same period, including the construction of irrigation canals. An example was the construction of the Dugale del Mona, dating back to the early 14th century. And imagine doing this and yet having essentially continuous raids that destroy everything, that oblige the communities to flee and that disrupt this entire system. Again, this was the typical strategy to take a commune, to bring a commune to his knees. That is to say, destroying the countryside, because, of course, the cities existed only because there was a countryside that was able to support them. And there is really a lot of stuff going on. The Visconti infiltrate pretty much everywhere to become lords of neighboring cities. You have a lot of amphibious warfare going on the Po River at that point against Parma as well. They raid each other's countryside. It's really fascinating. The same goes with Piacenza, etc. On wars, on boats, right? With artillery or crossbows bombardment from a bank on the enemy bank, the destruction of the ports as well, the infrastructures, facilities. That was really brutal. And a big deal changes from 1311, which, as you know, is the year in which Henry VII of Luxembourg descends after generations of imperial absence in Italy. Many people think that Henry VII expedition was just, he dies, Dante bet on him and nothing happened. Actually, Henry changed everything in the game, because he managed to recompact northern Italy under the Ghibelline hegemony, while Tuscany fundamentally was still siding with the Anjou. And yes, he died before he could march on Naples, which he was too, but after having, for example, destroyed Brescia and having been defeated, or having actually had to leave the walls of Florence because it was impregnable. And in 1311, Cremona had been invested by his lordship. Now, since the fact that she had been wealth was not exactly congruent with imperial imperial policy, Henry sacked the city, literally. Right? He arrived, supported again by his Ghibelline allies. That essentially the Visconti and the Della Scala are placed in power. At least the Visconti, after a period of exile, are brought back in Milan as Ghibelline rulers. The Della Scala in Verona are provided with Vicenza just as a possession on their own, and there are a few avamposts that managed to hold out the imperial onslaught, also because Henry has to go to Rome to be crowned, and he would come back and besiege Florence again. Pretty messed up things. There is a plague that kills lots of people. Henry's brother gets killed by the Brescians at the siege of their city. It's really a pretty messed up situation. And Henry needs money quickly, and Cremona basically sacked for that reason. In 1311, you have essentially, after the emperor leaves, Gilberto III da Correggio. This was another Reggian dynasty, again from Emilia. You have even Robert of Apulia in 1313. You have different guys that succeed one another in Cremona until the Cavalcabò under Giacomo managed to retake power. And interestingly enough, they are really committed to the Guelph cause at that point, because they are squeezed by. I mean, there is always this sense that the city is a faithful imperial subject. It's becoming rhetoric in many ways, but the Visconti are all around, so there is nothing to kid about. They need support from Naples, from the Guelph League, etc. Giacomo fights even in the Apennine, in the south, in Emilia, against the Visconti. There is a very brutal military history surrounding these affairs, but the truth is that Cremona is brutally under siege, right? And on November the 29th, 1322, the Viscontis, with Galeazzo I, managed to seize control of Cremona. And in just a few decades, you have the Cremonese commune fundamentally being still an autonomous reality that sends troops, I don't know, hundreds of milites and thousands of pedites around as an average thing. This thing shrinks dramatically and in size and in frequency, and the Visconti take over, and you basically do not have any evidence of any other Cremonese expedition happening ever again. This speaks volumes about what the Milanese were doing. Basically, Milan was this, again, massive system, right? And the bankers were, of course, funding the Visconti for expanding Milanese power to conquer these other communes, essentially, so cashing the banks of the local guys and keeping on expanding the system. Well, this money would be used to hire new mercenaries, especially the fierce German knights that have remained also after the Raumfahrt of Henry VII in Italy, and that are used by the main Ghibelline powers, namely Pisa and Milan, in fact, against, but not only, against the Guelph system. And it's war and war and war and war, right? And in the process, the Visconti finally managed to bring Milanese power to the extent that that Milan had always sort of dreamt of, right? Becoming sort of the rulers of Lombardy as a whole. Needless to say, this ends pretty much most of Cremona's autonomous policy, right? Because they were just under the Visconti, but there are other rulers here and there, especially in these first decades, namely Louis of Wittelsbach, Louis the Bavarian, that was emperor in 1327, and John of Luxembourg, King of Bohemia in 1331. This two are interesting because they're basically the follow-up of Henry VII. Henry VII's expedition was actually a big deal, was a massive one, also strategically, etc., that really did achieve considerable results. The ones of Ludwig and Charles were much smaller. Basically, Ludwig just wanted to go to Rome, get the crown, sacking as many cities along the way if he could. He tried even Milan after having kidnapped the Visconti, but he failed. on his way back to Germany, and quite opportunistically and cleverly, given that the Italian situation was really that messed up, just going back to Bavaria, sort of bailing out, even in a cultural sense. Think about the ideas of Marsilius of Padua, the further Germanization of the empire. I mean, of the sense that they had the Germanic emperors had to go into Italy, and fundamentally because they didn't have resources. Here the 14th century crisis is kicking in. Everything is territorializing, nationalizing way more than, say, in times of the Universal Empire. John of Luxembourg is this, instead of a king, essentially an errant knight. As you know, he would die at the Battle of Crécy, and he just enters Italy. The interesting thing is that he, like the others, were basically just paid with the resources of the Italians. There were some. Brescia was worried that these various Ghibelline lordships in northern Italy would take it over, so they called John from north of the Alps, that entered with a few hundreds of knights, right, just like in a fairy tale, right, and managed cleverly, even at that point, also exemplifying the collapse of the Guelph and the Ghibelline ideology, align himself with Bertrand de Pouget, that was the cardinal sent by the Pope John the 22nd to try to take out the Visconti, and failing so, but creating a lordship in Bologna and aligning himself with John, that should have at that point embodied the imperial authority, so something crazy. And the reason being that simply the northern Italian lordships were now truly ruling in their own home, and even expanding further, and becoming in fact also more internationally recognized as essentially Ghibelline vicars, right? So to say, well, if the emperor can't be there, let these guys be the rulers instead. It's very difficult to, say, sum up all the events that occur in these various generations, also because they're ever less relevant individually, right? You have the age of the soldiers of fortune, the general decline of the smaller centers compared to the bigger ones, at least in a political sense. Of course, there is the general crisis, so there's a demographic and economical shrinking everywhere. But you have this bigger states like Milan taking over this entire area, sort of regional states, and consolidating on that basis. The Visconti remain in charge, aside from this relatively brief interruptions of these guys would come back north of the Alps, until 1403. Then you have the reconquest of the Cremonese lordship by the old Cavalcabal family, because these lineages survived, very often just, being not more dangerous than others. But this was also just merely a coup. Again, they are just relatively little episodes per se. In any case, the Cavalcabal end badly, because on July the 25th, 1406, Cabrino Fondulo, that was the captain of Ugolino Cavalcabal's troops, massacred the males of the Cavalcabal family by deception. This is typical, because these houses were essentially becoming ever more dynastic in nature. Again, this is what happens everywhere in Europe. We've seen it in every single case. Like the fascinating thing against the constructionistic BS of diversity is that basically all the pattern is always the same. 14th century Europe crisis, before it was great expansion and more sort of participation and universal powers. Here, universal powers in crisis, the locals dynastize. It's always the same picture everywhere, right? Just a different souls, different in the different countries, but it's the same old damn thing. And the aforementioned Fondulo takes over the Cremonese lordship, because that was the ultimate aim. But of course, at this point, Cremona had become insignificant in the bigger picture against Milan. Here there were all problems of succession, as you know, in the Visconti family, etc. So that were backs and forths wars with Venice without powers. But this guy is not capable of maintaining power, and he retires to Castellone in exchange for 40,000 gold florins paid by the Visconti family. Was the price of a city, and that's what basically they bought with that, not to cause further issues. Right, so that in 1406 the lordship of Cremona passed to Filippo Maria Visconti, who made it at that point hereditary for his family. And with this act, Cremona in fact enters the Duchy of Milan, right, that would remain in until essentially the Italian unification. Under the Visconti and the Sforza, Cremona had this intense cultural and religious development, because again, you could be knocked out as an independent power, but this was still again one of the richest regions in the world. You have the Renaissance, you have humanism going on, you have a lot of wealth all around. You're part of a bigger state. In 1411, the Cittanova Palace becomes, for example, the seat of the University of Fustian merchants, which naturally reveals the degree of industry that was a bit typical of Lombardy. In fact, from this very early times already. In June 1431, near to Cremona, the fleet of the Duchy of Milan engaged in combat with a Venetian one, which intended from the river to conquer Cremona. Again, there is a lot of very interesting amphibious warfare that we absolutely have to make a video on as far as as northern Italy is concerned. And this battle was very bloody, by the way. You know that the Venetians at this point had created a terra firma state to counter exactly the Milanese expansion, and they arrive as close as Bergamo to Milan. Not bad for, just a maritime republic that had been traditionally phobic of, interland expansion. But the Venetians have also very advanced mode of administering. They're a bit more sensitive to the local particularities, let's say. They have also very strong army. The Venetian Condotta, together with the Burgundian ordinances, is the most advanced army of the time. The Milanese are also very strong, and they have essentially the most homogeneous state at this point among the various Italian ones. Right, it's the truly one that tends to uniform everything administratively. They have a strong, heavy sort of. In fact, that they were the strongest power in Italy for sure. Rivaling at least with Venice and Naples at this point. In this battle, the Venetians lost more than 2,500 men killed, right? And the Visconti ships emerged victorious from the engagement, just off Cremona, which in 1441 was chosen, by the way, to celebrate the wedding between Francis I Sforza and Bianca Maria Visconti, in essentially that mechanism of Milanese succession, with, in fact, the Sforza, these were famous soldiers of fortune marrying the heiress of the Visconti fortune, so the Lombard state. This occurred on October the 25th in the small temple built by the Benedictines that was replaced by the church of St. Sigismund, built at least in a slightly later period. And there is just a saying that is actually false. It was invented by the Cremonese confectionery industry in the early 20th century, that during the wedding banquet of Francesco Sforza and Bianca Maria Visconti, the nougat was served for the first time, right? And this is a well-known product of Verona, right? This is not true historically, but it's important to stress. If you think about Parma with cheese and ham, all this stuff, Cremona as well just closing as a countryside, agriculture, etc., had this enormous culinary tradition, right? And so the floridity, the prosperity, the wealth, the abundance of these countrysides was just becoming at this point a matter of also, type of food that would be historically associated with the city. Ludovico il Moro also financed important works in Cremona, for example, for the cathedral, such as raising the pediment in the construction of the portico called the Bertazzola, also the partial marble cladding of the baptistery, the renovation of the facade of the Church of St. Agatha, as well as the town hall. So again, it was normal for these lords to strengthen the importance of the various cities, also because it was a way from there to control the various lords in the countryside that kept is existing sometimes, planning coups, etc., together with the rivals, the Venetians, etc. And the city it remains evidently the cornerstone of these administrations. They are infrastructurally served, they're consolidated, they're fortified, right? Because war is behind the corner on a regular basis. For example, in 1446, Cremona is surrounded by the troops of Francesco Piccinino and Luigi dal Verme, that are some famous, very famous actually, soldiers of fortune at the time. The Venetians that want, of course, the city to autonomize herself, because if you get her, you get this, again, important chunk running longitudinally from, say, in the east, the Venetian possessions, in the west, pretty close to Milan, as we've seen, and they sent another soldier of fortune of theirs that was Scaramuccia da Forlì to support Cremona, and in fact together they managed to overcome the siege, and causing the two leaders to abandon the city, right? And then you have all a history, say, that mostly pertains to what we call the modern age, right? And so that's something we stopped to. But this was a bit the history of the city in outlook. I think it's quite interesting because you always see the same pattern in these Italian cities: Roman foundation, continuity in Longobards times, bishop counts in Carolingian Ottonian times. Then they fight as part of the Lombard League against the Holy Roman Emperor. Then they fight against each other and succumb to the lordship of the strongest. And then they become object of contention between the strongest, and they losing basically all their liberty in it. This is, in a nutshell, the thing. It's definitely fascinating, and I'm glad when we cover these, especially in just one shot, let's say, because sometimes the history is quite big. You need 2 videos to actually make this, but it's still nice to be able to discuss this, and I hope, of course, to be continuing with this. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.